Hello everybody, I'm Junia Doan, and this is Uncommon Sense. Thank you for joining us. My guest is Rob Worsley. He is the director of the Midland Community Former Offender Advocacy and Rehabilitation Effort. He earned an associate degree in law enforcement from Delta College right here, and he served in the Army for 3 years. So welcome, Rob.
Thank you.
Now, what got you interested in law enforcement?
Well, as a young man, I had heard stories about my great-grandfather. He was the chief of detectives in Detroit Police Department in the late teens and early 20s. And my grandmother at the time had a scrapbook of many of the things that he had done while he worked as the chief of detectives in Detroit. He had escorted the Prince of Wales through the United States. He had done security at the Republican Convention in Chicago numerous times. He was also a ventriloquist. He had 2 puppets in Greenfield Village and was personal friends with Henry Ford. And my grandma would tell me about the stories of him coming home and telling her about the thieves and stuff that he had taken into custody that day. And it always just kind of was very interesting for me. As I got closer to graduating from high school, I decided to enlist in the service. For some stability. There was a lot of things going on in General Motors and Dow at the time that weren't lucrative for me to stay in the community, so I thought it would be best if I went in the service and got some stability. When I got out of the service, Jim McNutt was the sheriff at the time.
Yes.
And Bill Fillmore, a friend of mine in high school, had done Marine Patrol for him, and I saw him down at Emerson Park at a softball game, and he said, "Hey, they're looking for a deputy to go to work in the jail," and so I saw that as an opportunity for me, and I had just gotten out of the service, so I was hired in at that time.
What did you learn by being in that jail?
Well, one of the things that I'd always had in my heart, and one of the things that I always liked about working in the community, was I always had a heart for people that were less fortunate than myself. I always looked at the sheriff's office, and I got a lot of this from John Reeder, that we are more of a public service law enforcement entity than a strict enforcement entity, that we helped people in the community as well as enforcing the laws. In the jail, unfortunately, for many of the people that come in there, you saw them at some of their worst times, and they were obviously quite desperate being in there and having their freedom taken away from them. I also understood that there was a responsibility and a job that I had to do to keep them there and keep them safe. And I guess more than anything, I learned from those individuals that things can always be worse, and you should be happy for the things that you have in life and for the good things that you have.
And when did you take the next step?
I had worked in the jail for about 10 years. John Reeder had taken over as sheriff for Jim McNutt when he went to the the state rep position for Michigan, and he had suggested to me that there was going to be a split between the compensation for people working in the jail and people working on the road as patrol deputies. So I took it upon myself to return to Delta at that time. I went through the police academy here. I got certified as a police officer by the state of Michigan, and then I started working as a patrol deputy. I worked as a traffic enforcement deputy for about 4 years. I got promoted to sergeant. I was assistant shift leader for about 3 years. I got promoted to lieutenant. I did that for about 2 years, and then I got promoted to captain and took over the jail operation and was the jail administrator until I retired.
That's impressive.
Thank you.
You are to be congratulated.
Thank you.
I can see how people would depend on you and rely on you. And so did you look around then and say, what's next?
Well, I had aspirations. One of the things that I did, and I had counseled with John a lot, and one of the things I wanted to do when I started moving up in the ranks through the road patrol was to go back and oversee the jail operation. Probably the best, or one of the people in law enforcement I mostly looked up to, Lyle Schreiber, was the jail administrator when I was there as a deputy. He had passed on. So I wanted to reach that goal in my career at the sheriff's office. Once I reached that goal, it wasn't shortly thereafter, maybe 4 or 5 years, Jerry Nielsen became the sheriff. At that time, I decided that I had fulfilled what I wanted to do in the sheriff's office. I had had many good experiences working with offenders in the jail as well as out in the community, and decided that it would be in my best interest and hopefully something fulfilling for the other individuals I'd be interacting with to go to work for Michigan Department of Corrections in the prison system, and that's what I did after I retired from the sheriff's office.
That sounds very frightening. Is it?
No, it's, there's obviously you have to have a respect for where you're at and what
Yes.
you're doing. A lot of people couldn't deal with that kind of circumstance, but because of the years of, walking into
Yes.
people's homes and telling people what to do, because once they invited me in there, then I make the decisions. If they
Yes.
didn't want me there, then they shouldn't have called. And of course, doing that in a very cordial way, not demanding or forcing people to do things. So when I entered into the prison, it was a whole different atmosphere. We had about 105 people in the county jail. The first prison I worked at had 1,200 inmates.
Oh.
And when they opened the yard, 1,200 guys came out of their units and were walking all around you and everywhere. So, but fortunately, I say fortunately, I worked in a minimum security prison. We had 5 different levels of security in the Michigan Department of Corrections. And I found great opportunities to interact with individuals, to try to give them some positive mentoring, and actually to give them hope for when they left that incarceration and what they could potentially do back in the communities where they came from.
Could you tell who would be open to that and who would benefit from that?
Well, right at first, I was a little apprehensive myself because I came from such a small operation to such a huge impacting, having that many offenders walking around you and engaging with them. Even in the housing units, there would be like 160 people in one unit, and you'd be in there by yourself or with one other deputy, or one other corrections officer, excuse me. And what I did is I befriended one of the offenders there that was doing time there, and used him as an in-between between myself and other prisoners. And I started to teach pre-release classes in the prison, and I used this individual to kind of screen and go between. And once they saw that he was accepting of me, then it was much easier to gain their confidence and work with them. And so it was, I actually have to credit him more than myself for giving me that in-between to go through to reach those individuals there.
What did you feel it was important to teach in pre-release training?
Well, we had several programs that we did. Some were to deal with anger issues, which go back to
yes.
pre-adolescence, to nurturing fathers, and they were kind of a combined program. Unfortunately, not just in our state prison system, but throughout the nation, most offenders, male offenders, come from single-parent homes where there was either abuse, substance, physical, sexual, or mental abuse in those homes. And so I would work with them to go back to the times in their life when they started to recognize that things weren't the way they were supposed to be, or what they would expect or see in other families, and try to put those issues in perspective so they could, once they left the institution, could go out and make positive contributions for themselves and the communities that they lived in.
What I'm thinking is, aren't there Christian groups that come in and try something like
Yes.
that? I don't know, perhaps there are other groups. And do you feel you were successful? This pre-release program kept them out of jail, out of prison?
Yeah, I mean, it was the initial stages of interacting in that. When I started working in the prison system in 2006, Michigan Prisoner Reentry was just starting then. And so it started in some of the larger metropolitan areas of the state, and then it really took off inside of the system, inside the prison walls. And we weren't really able to see the full impact of that until maybe 3 or 4 later after the programming had started. What I can do, I can relate it to what I did in Midland. I worked in the institution for 2 years. When prisoner reentry came to Midland, I left the institution, came out and started the program in Midland and Bay County. And I know that in the 4.5 years I did that.
This was the Arnold program. This was not the Arnold program.
Yeah, that was for the Arnold
Yes,
Center.
okay.
They were my fiduciary, and then
Yes.
the funding came through this MDOC, through the governor's office, to the fiduciary in Saginaw.
Okay.
And what I started to do is track recidivism rates from what they were when I started MDOC until I was there working for 2 years. And we had greatly impacted those numbers. Now, that wasn't just because of Rob Worsley. There was a whole group of people and a whole different initiative and perspective of how to deal with offenders prior to the release and once they're taken back into the community. But at one time when I was contracted through the state, I wasn't able to speak about statistical things, but now I'm not, so I can. So we had went from about a 38% recidivism rate in Midland County, and they measure that over a 2-year period from when I started in 2006. And when I measured that same time frame at the end of 2012, when my position was ended with the Arnold Center, we were below 8% in Midland County.
That's
So
amazing.
something's working, and I think a lot of it has to do with the faith community, the community assistance groups in Midland, and hopefully I had some impact in that also. And obviously the funding that came from the state made a difference as it came down through the Arnold Center and came into my office. Because prior to the initiative, when a person got out of prison, they were basically on their own to fend for themselves.
Long. That was, yeah.
And it didn't work.
No. Now, what you're doing now, is that similar or identical to what you did under the, or in collaboration with the fiduciary, the Arnold Center?
Yes, it's similar, but what I'm doing now is far more reaching. At that time, I was contracted with the state, and the funding that they gave to my operation was strictly for active parolees. Now my new program that I've started since the first of the year, I work with all former offenders in the community. My funding, I'm just working on that now, and it's coming from foundations and different faith communities and some private donors. And so what I'm doing is, since that money was very directed at only a very small segment of the offender population, which were active parolees coming out of prison, I've opened my doors to all offenders now. And just since the first of the year, I've had over 75 people through my office that are, jail inmates, as well as people that have successfully discharged from parole, have maxed out in prison, or are no longer under the authority of the state. So,
is it optional for them, or is that a requirement as part of their exiting from jail or the prison?
No, it's never been required, even when I was under prisoner reentry. Now, their agents, parole agents and probation agents, could strongly suggest it.
I see.
But it was never a requirement. And what I'm doing now is purely advocating for offenders to try to get them back on track, to try to give them opportunities in the community, so you and I and the people we care about and love don't become victims of one of them. And secondly, so they have an opportunity to actually succeed. And the whole purpose of what I'm doing now, since I'm doing it on my own, is to give them hope.
Yes.
And, if we don't have hope, we don't have much else in our life, and that's why I continue to do it.
And that comes from a person, doesn't it? From a connection with a
Sure.
person?
Yep.
Although you always have to talk yourself into it pretty heavily. That's a compliment to you, that you have so many people,
Well, I appreciate that.
ready to show up within a couple of months.
Yeah, and when I went to the foundations in some of the faith communities, the big concern, since I had come out from under the umbrella of the state, was where are referrals going to come from and how are you going to get people into your office? And I said, they'll come because they know me and they trust me.
Yes.
They know me from when I worked in law enforcement, when I worked in corrections, when I was the jail administrator. I treated people with decency and respect. Even when I had to do my job, I still treated them with respect. They know that I don't play games with their lives or try to spin them around and send them on their way. So they trust me and they come to me, and they know. It's one of the things I tell the faith community is not only do they accept that if I tell them I'm going to do something for them, they know it's going to happen. Even maybe more important than that, when I tell them that it's not going to happen, they're okay with that too, because if Rob can't do it, it's probably not going to happen.
How do you really work with someone who's been abused, who has anger and doesn't trust people, who's very scared or very nervous? Can you turn that around? How do you turn that around?
Well, I've always since I've been advocating for offenders, which was probably the last 3 years I was the jail administrator, and for the last 5 plus, well, probably 7 years, the 2 years I worked inside the prison and 5 years that I've been doing it outside of the prison. What I tell people is the first thing you have to do with offenders is you have to meet their basic life needs. You have to feed them, you have to give them clothes, and you have to give them a place to sleep. Without their basic life needs, they'll go and find those in ways that aren't beneficial to them or to you and I in our community. So what I do is I help to provide those basic life needs. Then once I gain that rapport and trust with them, then I start to lead them down the path that will allow them to open themselves up to work on those issues that have been detrimental to them from the time they were young children through their adult life to where they're at today. And because of the relationship that I've built with people, and it's word of mouth of other offenders, and they tell, hey, if you want something done or if you need something, go to this guy. He's the one that'll help you and he'll show you the way. If he can't get it for you, he'll find a place to get it. It builds a rapport, it builds a trust, and then I can open some of those very sensitive doors that they've held in for most of their life or all of their life, and they're willing one-on-one to sit down and talk about those things with me. And we found out through working in the prison system as well as advocating for offenders outside, until you get people to address those things, they're always going to be stuck in that same mindset and have that same feeling of that their life is of little value or they have no self-esteem. Or so
I would think it would be difficult for people like that to have a sense that they can handle things, that they can cope with life. How do you address that? Because even if you make a connection, do you have to train them a little on how to act?
Yes. Part of what I do is it's called cognitive behavior change. We talk about the issues that have brought them to where they're at in their life, and we have to realize that they have made some choices that bring them to the place where they are. There's probably not one offender that has come into my doors and said, when I grow up, it was always my aspiration when I grew up that I wanted to go to jail and be a prisoner. Yeah. Nobody wants that in their life, but it is what it is, and you have to go there where they're at and face it. Many of these offenders came from parents who were offenders, and there was substance abuse and other issues in the home, and that's what they know, that's what they understand, that's how they provided for themselves. So I have to get them to understand that there's a better way to do this that doesn't rob you of your freedom, that doesn't put you out there so you have to continually face all of these barriers in society. And those barriers include housing and employment and all those basic things that many people take for granted. They have never been in a position to take those things for granted per se. And I do another thing, it's called positive peer mentoring. I try to get them to engage with either myself or someone that I brought into the program that they can look up to. If they're always looking down and looking at where they're at, they're never going to look up and get out of where they are. And so it's a long process with many of them.
Years, I would guess.
Yeah, and what's kind of funny, it's not funny, but it happens. Many of the guys that come to see me today came and saw me 5 years ago and came and saw me when I was the jail administrator, and I interacted with them when I was a police officer in the community. They still come to me because they know that I'll look out for them and that I care about what happens to them. And so I do have some guys that in 1980, when I started in the sheriff's office, they still come and see me today. So
that's to your credit.
Yeah, and it's what,
because you are the person that perhaps they would like to be.
You have to give them someone to look up to, someone that they can mirror themselves after, because all they've had in their life is other people looking down on them or having other family members that they look down upon because they're even worse off or in more trouble than they are. So they have to have a model of some sort, and I'm certainly not trying to edify myself as that person, but just like everything else in life, you have to set a positive example and be that person so somebody can look up and say, I hope that someday I'm able to do those things and I can have a family and I can have my own house and I can drive my own car and it won't be breaking down every other day. So a lot of it is rebuilding their self-worth.
How do you do that?
Well, like I said before, first you have to get them nurtured.
Right.
Then you have to build relationship with them, and then you have to make sure that you follow through on the things that you're going to tell them that you're going to do, because they've been disappointed enough in life. They don't need further disappointments from somebody who tells them that they're going to help them. And the great thing about it is my office is there to advocate and assist offenders, whoever they are in the community. And my hope is that someday that they will be able to go out and contribute to our community rather than to be a burden financially or otherwise on our community, because many of these young men and ladies have children. And as you know, they have an obligation and a responsibility to those children to show them the way. And if they are shown the same way that they were shown when they were young kids, we're never going to get on top of this.
They could even go into the school. I don't want to, I'm not into
Sure.
the school, but and talk about, and don't do what I did.
Yeah, I have one offender, I hate to talk, a former offender,
Yeah.
that I take with me to all my community assistance meetings and stuff. He is kind of going, I try to mentor him for the day when I'm no longer able to get myself in there to do these things. I would like someone like him to be able to step in and take over and be the right person to meet the needs of those in the community.
How interesting. Do you think a sense of perseverance, it's like changing a habit, any kind of a habit. It takes trial and repetition and
Sure.
the commitment sometimes to do it, especially when you're pushing through some of the really heavy kinds of things that you're describing. How important is that commitment to getting through it rather than just saying, oh, the world's against me? And
Sure. There are, what I've done in the past is that, I don't know if you've ever heard of the cycle of violence,
No.
where there's violence in the home, and then children learn that's how you get things, and that's how you get order, through violence, through physical violence, and it escalates into domestic violence. And when a young man sees his father abusing his mother, since he loves his father, it must be okay, and that's how you treat women. Basically, what I do is I tell these young men, when I started in the sheriff's office, I had your grandfather in jail, and when I was working on the road, I arrested your dad, and now you're in this situation. You need to be the person to break this cycle. You need to be the one to step up and say, I'm going to man up, and this isn't going to be my family trait any longer. I'm going to change this. And I always tell them, regardless of their age, you can't go back. All we can do is look forward. So let's make everything that we do from today forward be a positive thing in your life instead of a negative. Is it easy to do? No. They bump their heads all the time, and they fall down, and they run their heads into walls because they can't get past those barriers, because a lot of people in society, justifiably so sometimes, won't allow them to get through those
Yeah.
barriers. But that's why I'm there, to encourage them and to keep them going and keep them persevering and pressing on, because if they don't have someone doing that for them, they will revert to what they know, and what they know isn't usually good for them or for us in the community.
Do you practice what you teach them in your personal life? Have you learned things from this whole wonderful career that you take back to your own living and your own relationships?
Sure. I was, I guess I can talk a little bit about my growing up. I had 4 brothers and sisters growing up. We lived up in Sanford. We came up to Michigan from Toledo. We lived in Toledo till I was 7 or 8 years old. We moved into Sanford. My dad was a severe alcoholic, ended up dying of cirrhosis at a very young age. There was much abuse physically in our home, my brother and I, and my mother, unfortunately, and she passed a year ago this past summer. So I actually lived in these situations, and I knew that that's not something I wanted for my family or my children if God gave me the opportunity to have a family and children. And so that probably helped me to soften my heart for others that I saw in these same situations. As I was growing up, I think my father left our home when I was around 10 years old. My mom raised 5 children with no support from my father, never paid any support, never was around, never actually impacted our lives in any way. And I lived on my own from the time I was 15. My mother moved to Florida. I didn't like the circumstances down there, so I bought a plane ticket and flew back up to Michigan. And when I was 17, I joined the Army while I was in high school. When I graduated from high school, I went in the service. And so I've been kind of doing this on my own since I was 15. So it has probably given me some of the passion and compassion for working with people. In part, I look at it now as it was maybe not such a great thing then, but now that I can relate to it, it's very beneficial for what I'm doing in the community now.
I want to thank you for being with us and being so generous with your experience and personal and professional. Well, we've learned a lot. First of all, be grateful for wherever you are because other people have it a lot worse. Secondly, if you mess up, you can change it. And you certainly wouldn't want to continue bad things throughout the generations. Thirdly, you know that you have to get the basics, food, shelter, but then you move into the trust issues, your relationships. Be sure you learn or get with someone who can teach you how to get along with others. And also, you have to be a person of your word. If you say you are going to do it, you do it. There aren't any, oh, I forgot about it, or stuff like that. Because the way you build people's trust towards you, the way they have confidence in you, in your home or anywhere else you work, is that you are able to do that. And of course, if you have an uncontrollable temper, you have to work on that because that's not useful to you or anybody you love or the community. And there are ways that you can do this too. So be mindful, look for help. You can call 211. You can call Rob for that matter, and he would be glad to help you. And I'm so glad that this resource is available in our community. So what I want you to do, as I say every time, go out every day, be grateful, and say something kind or do something kind for someone you know and someone you don't know, and do it again the next day and the next day and the next day, so that you can be a giver of light in your community and in your life. Thank you so very much for joining us this time. And I really look forward to seeing you the next time. And may you have the most blessed of days and weeks. And thank you, Rob. It's just been a joy to have you. And I'm so sorry we have to end so quickly. It's
okay.
not something I would prefer to do, but it just whips through and there you are. So thank you so again. It's been great to have you. And thank you for sharing so very much of your life with us.
Thank you.
To contact Junia, send her an email at info@juniadone.com. For more information, program schedules, and news about future guests, go to www.juniadone.com. Thanks for joining us. See you next time for Uncommon Sense with Junia Doan.